welcome along to Tweet Street Scotland Occupy, home of the satirical saltire. I'm Cinnamon Bridges, aka Peter. With me tonight, I've got a couple of co-hosts. I've got my usual one man, JB Whitesnake. All right, JB, how's it going, buddy?
Not bad, Peter. Good to see you in a summer evening, even though it's a bit chilly.
It's a wee bit chilly, but nice. It brightened up today. I thought it was going to rain. It's good to see you as well, buddy. It's good to see you. And we've also got Jan. Jan, it's good to see you. How are you doing?
Fine. Aye.
Now, Jan was the person that initiated this guest that we've got, because asking the question about Willie McRae in particular. So we invited along author Ron Culley, who's a Glasgow man, written 14 books, edited 2, biographies, humorous books, Irish politics, travel books, written novels in big oil, gun control in America. But since 2014, following the referendum, have all been about Scottish independence and the perfidious Albion. Hi, Ron. It's great to have you here. Welcome along.
A considerable pleasure, Peter.
Now, like we always do here on Tweet Street, we like to find out a wee bit about the person before they became the person they are, or what made them the person they are. So, for our viewers, subscribers, and for us here as well, Ron, tell us a wee bit about yourself, where you grew up, what made you become Ron Culley of the day?
Well, I grew up in Pollock in a housing estate in Glasgow, and with a single parent family. My mother, but I was largely brought up with my grandparents in a tenement in Pollock. Went to school, didn't like school particularly, got expelled from school, bummed about with British Rail, did bits and pieces, and then I get involved with youth work, community work and so forth. Became a social worker, moved into economic development, and ended up chief executive of Scottish Enterprise in Glasgow, chief executive of the Transport Authority in the west of Scotland. And when I retired, I was sitting one night watching a magazine programme, and they were talking about the importance of first lines in books, which I found interesting. And at that point in my life, I hadn't written a word. And I remember thinking, you know, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, you know, A Tale of Two Cities, and it was the importance of first lines. And I wrote 10 first lines down, and I picked one. And just out of interest, that first line became a first paragraph, became a first chapter, and became a book about gun control in America. And at the same time, I wrote a book called I Belong to Glasgow, which was a biography of myself, coming from a single parent household to a head bummer in economic development. And when I retired, I started writing books. As you mentioned, I've now written 14 of them. But I'm now passionate about writing books about Scottish independence and about the ways in which the British establishment will attempt to stop the democratic process in Scotland, whether it was about security services infiltrating the Scottish government at the highest reaches, whether it was about dark money coming in through the Conservative Party from Ireland, all of which is true, by the way, whether it was about Willie McRae or my latest book, Dalriada, which is about one man developing a civil disobedience campaign for Scottish independence because he's had enough. And the reason I do that, I mean, I could write, as I have done, but the very last book I've written is Firebrand, which is about Willie McRae, which I hope is a definitive account of McRae, which is a factual account of the man's life and his death. But the reason I write novels in this way is to make them more accessible, to tell a story that people will enjoy reading, which nevertheless informs them about the way in which the British establishment can and do behave, not in the interests of Scotland. And now, as I say, this is my 15th book I'm writing, McRae. So I've lost count. It's 14 or 15. And I've started a new book called, which at the minute his working title is For As Long as 100 of Us Remain Alive.
I wonder what that's about.
And I confess, I absolutely love writing. And I retired 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And if it wasn't for writing, I don't know what I'd be doing, but I suspect.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for that. Right, what we're going to do now, Ron, is because the main ethos of this particular podcast is finding out a wee bit more about Willie McRae than we already know, and who better than the man that's now written 2 books about it. But we want to get pretty much the journey from Alba, who shot Willie McRae, to the latest one, Firebrand. What you've discovered along the way, and the focus is going to be mainly on you, so we'll put you on screen here. Sure. But first of all, why write Alba, who shot Willie McRae in the first place?
Well, I came to this, I mean, in 1985, when McRae was shot, I remembered a wee bit about it, but I didn't remember much about it. And then I came across the story again. I thought, you know, that's a wee bit smelly. So I started reading more about it, and the more I wrote, you know, there's a book in this. And so I wrote a novel, but it was a well-researched novel, if I say so myself. I made sure, because when you look at, if movies are maybe the best example, when you look at movies like Braveheart or The Alamo, where you know, they bear little resemblance to the actual story, the truth of the story. So I decided that I was going to tell the true story of McRae's death in a docu-entertainment way, but that where I departed from the truth, as I did, because I introduced the McCrone report. Now, Willie McRae would have known nothing about the McCrone report. It didn't become known until long after he had died, but I wanted to tell that story as well. So I introduced that to the book. But at the end, about 2 chapters at the end, one of which was a whole series of this didn't happen, Prince Philip didn't visit the shipyards at that time, and so forth, just to make sure that nobody could say, well, this is just a fiction. I told the story exactly as I understood it, and where I departed from the truth, I set that out as well. So I just wanted to tell the story, and it's been very successful.
It has been very successful. John?
Yeah, you mentioned there about the McCrone report, and you brought it into the storyline. Can you extrapolate a wee bit on that for us? What impact do you think that had on him and his death?
Well, it wouldn't have had any impact on McRae's death, because he would have known nothing about it. That said, it was evident that Edward Heath, when he was Prime Minister, maybe there's a wee connection, Edward Heath, when he was Prime Minister, introduced this request of an analysis of the Scottish economy now that they've discovered oil. And when the top economic senior civil servant in Scotland wrote the report, only a short report, it was mind-blowing, because it said that Scotland would become the richest nation in Europe. It would be wealthier than the Swiss. The Scots pound would be stronger than the English pound. And so what they did was they said, bury it. And not only did they say bury it, they buried it for 33 years. And they set out the myth that Scotland was too poor, too wee, too stupid to be independent, when they knew that the reverse was the case. And so I wanted to tell that story as well. And I just thought it would offer an embellishment to the McRae story. Not that it needed any bloody embellishments, but I just did it for dramatic effect. The only connection was that McRae, as I'll come to later, was alleged to have been in possession of a file about paedophilia in the highest reaches of the Scottish judiciary and in politics. And one of the people who have subsequently been named as being on that list was Edward Heath. So I don't know whether Heath may or may not have decided that he'd rather this didn't come out or whatever. But it's a pretty fragile link. But the only link I can think of between Heath and McRae.
Okay.
John?
Well, I mean, he worked with Mountbatten, who was allegedly involved with the Kincora Boys School when he was back in the Navy.
Aye.
And then there's the link you're saying with Ted Heath. Well, it was Margaret Thatcher's government when he died, wasn't it?
Correct. Aye. It was. I mean,
And
it was.
but a couple of months after that, Jeffrey Dickens. Aye. So, and I was watching the Scottish Eye about Willie McRae, and one of the ladies that they interviewed said, "I've got them this time. They're not getting out of this."
Aye.
But he never let on what he was talking about, whether it was the nuclear waste or perhaps this list.
Yeah, or drugs, or a number of things. But McRae came from humble stock. He was born in Carron, just outside Falkirk, to Fergus and Catherine in 1923. His father was an electrician, but he went to university. He had a fine mind. He got a first-class degree in history, joined the Seaforth Highlanders, was deployed to Malaya, and commissioned into the Royal Indian Navy, where he was promoted to lieutenant. And then, as you say, John, he was appointed aide-de-camp to Lord Louis Mountbatten, the great-grandson of Queen Victoria, God bless him, and who was appointed the Viceroy of India. So McRae got to know Gandhi, Nehru. He learned Urdu, and I interviewed for Firebrand. I interviewed one of his friends, Bill Henderson, who said, you know, he would sit up in his cottage in Dorney and blether away, and he talked about how when he was aide-de-camp to Mountbatten, he would make speeches in front of the top brass of the British establishment. He would make comments in Urdu about encouraging the local population to free themselves from their colonial oppressors. Loud cheers from the audience, but the people behind him didn't know hee-haw about what he was saying. Although it did become evident that the British security services, even then, had decided that McRae was worth the watching. So from a way back then, he was someone who was treated with some considerable suspicion by the security services. When he came back to Glasgow, he studied law, and he joined the firm of Abraham Levy, which is now Levy and McRae, which still operates to this day in St Vincent Street in Glasgow. He helped write the Israelis' maritime law, and there has been a stone raised to him near Nazareth, where he's honoured by the Israeli government by the planting of 3,000 trees. And he was never that interested in politics at that juncture. But things changed in 1967 when Winnie Ewing won Hamilton. Willie joined, and in 1974 he fought the Ross and Cromarty seat. He was beaten by Lord Hamish Gray of the Conservative Party. Scotland was a different place in those days. And in 1978, when William Wolfe stood down as leader, he contested the leadership but lost to Gordon Wilson. He was elected vice chairman, responsible for administration, and he was also the legal advisor of the SNP. So he succeeded to high office within the SNP, and he was a legal advisor. But he was also reputed to have been involved with the dark underbelly of Scottish politics, the SNLA, the Oyster Catchers, Dark Harvest Commando. And that was a particular, I mean, I did a lot of research into that, and I found that quite an interesting time in Willie McRae's life.
Right, John, back to you.
Right, so you were saying you're talking there about Willie McRae and what he was like as a person. You mentioned these other sort of the dark underbelly there. Just explain to us, for those who might not be aware of them, just a brief version of who they were.
I'm currently reading a book by Wendy Wood, who started an organisation called the Scottish Patriots, and who was also a founding member of the SNP. And in those days, you've got to remember, the SNP was a much smaller operation than it is these days. It was almost it was a very much a small feature of Scottish politics. And so what happened was a number of organisations started to spring up, which were, as one of Willie's contemporaries, Len Murray, said, you got to remember that Willie was more nationalist than most nationalists. He, according to Adam Busby, who was a member of the Scottish National Liberation Army, that he and David Dinsmore were involved in sending out, they were sending bombs, parcel bombs, all over to Tory members of Parliament. They sent one to Glasgow City Council on the day that Lady Diana Spencer was visiting, and it exploded, but did no damage other than to a carpet, which they had to renew. They would be placing bombs in the pathways of the lorries that took the nuclear warheads south for maintenance. And these bombs could explode, but they had disabled the timers so that they wouldn't explode. I mean, it would have been a bit daft if you're interested in the future of Scotland to explode a nuclear bomb on your doorstep. But it nevertheless made the point that these lorries were vulnerable to attack. And they also, Lord Roy Jenkins won a seat in Hillhead for the UK Parliament, and they planned to put petrol in order to be accused, not to be accused of being a carpetbagger. He bought a flat in the West End of Glasgow, and they were proposing to put petrol through his letterbox and ignite it. But they messed it up, and he was not harmed. And then when McRae allegedly, according to them, was being followed by Special Branch and them, and they noticed the cars. They wrote down the number plates of the cars, and McRae took them to his office, gave them £200, and in a pretty cute move, they phoned up British Airways and booked 2 flights to Dublin, knowing that Special Branch were on their tail. They booked 2 flights to Dublin in the names of 2 regular people in the SNP. And then, knowing that the Special Branch guy in Glasgow Airport finished at 9 o'clock, they waited until he had left, phoned up, cancelled the 2 bookings, and then booked the same seats in their own real names, turned up with their passports and all the rest of it, and fled to Ireland successfully. And said, a lovely quote was, "We were so delighted at our achievement, we forgot to pick up our duty free." So, so they made it out of Scotland, and but McRae was also apparently responsible for the approach of with Dark Harvest Commando. He allegedly said to the SNLA boys, "Look, they're putting they're trying to put nuclear waste in the hills above Ayr and in the north of Scotland. Why not give them a taste of their own medicine and put some contaminated soil from the island of Grinyard, just off the coast of Scotland, and dump it at the Tory party conference in Blackpool," which they did, to a lot of media attention. The Tories were up to high dough about this. And then, in a stroke either of genius or sleekness, once that had died down, they said, that soil didn't come from the island. That soil came from the mainland. And it could only have got there by wind-blowing soil or spores coming across to the mainland. So anywhere in Scotland could be infected. And because another big stushy. And it was involved in the oyster catchers, which was an operation to frustrate illicit test boring in Glen Etive. Now, there is no documentary proof other than the statements made by SNLA individuals that McRae was behind all of that. But when you put together the fact of his involvement in these, or potential involvement in these organizations, his behavior in India, his successful one-man almost defense against the British Atomic Energy Authority to stop nuclear waste being buried in the hills above Ayr, and proposing to do it in Dunray up at the north of Scotland. When you add all that up together, the notion that the special branch and the MI5 were not interested in Willie McRae beggars belief. Beggars belief.
Well, when you're mentioning the MI5 and the special branch, there's a lot of rumours go about it. What sort of rumours? What was the sort of rumours you heard? But even back then.
Well, there was a Tory MP called Geoffrey Dickens was not held in particularly high regard by the Westminster Tories, because although he was a Tory MP in London, he'd been a goalkeeper. So what kind of job's that for a Tory MP? Plus, he had a very pronounced northern accent. So he wasn't actually an auditorium, but he was completely obsessed by right and wrong, and by rumours that he'd heard of paedophilia in the highest reaches of the political parties, not just the Tories, but also Labour and Liberals. We know about some of the Liberals that were involved as well. But he then put together a dossier and gave that dossier to Lord Britton, who was the Home Secretary. Yeah. And it was then lost. And allegedly that document also accused Lord Britton of being not uninvolved in these matters. But the file was lost. And much more recently, Tom Watson, who was then the deputy leader of the Labour Party, did his own investigation and said that files, over 100 files, had been lost, quotes, on an industrial scale by civil servants / members of parliament, just lost. Theresa May was asked when she was a prime minister to look into this, and she took the view that it was not in the interests of Britain to undertake any further research into this. I mean, it's just, so who knows? But McRae was alleged to be in possession of the same file. And as you say, Jan, he had said to a number of people, he said it to his friend, I've got them this time. He said, as he left Glasgow on the day that he drove to his death, he patted his briefcase and said, I've got them this time. And he said it to others. And of course, we will never know what was in that briefcase, because he drove to his death. And when the briefcase was recovered, despite him saying, I've got them this time, and patting his briefcase, I've got them this time, when the briefcase was returned to his brother, Dr. Fergus McRae, Fergus said there was nothing in it of any import, nothing other than a few bland papers, which kind of tends to suggest that either Willie was an absolute liar and fantasist, or perhaps, more likely, that whatever it was that was exciting his interest had been removed from the briefcase before it had been returned to his relatives.
Wow. It's mind-blowing, isn't it? It's fascinating how you get told something and then somebody else says, oh, I didn't have anything here. So it's either one or the other. On you go, Jan, sorry.
It was broken into a number of times, was he no?
His home at Queen's Park was broken into and nothing was stolen. His home in Dorney was broken into and nothing was stolen. His offices in Glasgow were broken into and nothing was stolen, despite the fact that he had a charity box with money on his desk and that hadn't been touched. And Donald Morrison, who was the police constable responsible for the city centre, his beat was a city centre, had been for years, who knew Willie McRae because he was giving him citations for court and so forth. knew him professionally. He saw him on the Friday that he was driving north. He'd gone into the off license in West Nile Street. He only drank Islay Mist whiskey, a blend, and he came out of Donald Morrison saw him coming out the off license with the 2 bottles and a carton of cigarettes. He put a bottle on top of the roof of his Volvo, which was, if you know West Nile Street, it's down the hill. His car was stopping. He put a bottle on top of it. Donald came across and took the bottle, said, "Would you blow into this bag, sir?" as a joke. And the 2 of them laughed about it. He got into his car. He took the bottle saying it'll slip. And when he got into his car, Donald noticed that he said it was manky. He said it was clatty, rather. He said it was clatty. And he gave him the bottle and said, "I'd put them in the footwell so they don't roll and break." And that's when he said, "I've got them this time, I've got them this time." He told him he was going north to Dorney in the Kyle of Lochalsh. And Donald said, "Well, hold on, I'll let you," and noticed that it was a 2-way street. And he stopped the traffic, allowed Willie to do a U-turn. And he noticed that 2 guys who he'd earlier noticed that there was 2 guys suspiciously looking at McRae. And when Willie drove away in the wrong direction, they ran across to 2 other cars, did U-turns and followed them up the hill and out at speed, going through a red light at the top of the road. And but as you say, Jan, he had been broken into, and Donald Morrison spoke to an affidavit that his office had been broken into. He had witnessed it. He was told to stand. You're all too young to remember McCormick's music shop in Hopes in Bath Street.
Aye, definitely.
You go down into it. You go down it, and he was told to stand down there and not let anybody touch the car. And plainclothes people went in and out, taking boxes of files out of his office and putting them in. They were then taken to Stewart Street Police Station, where they were photocopied. And Donald Morrison assisted in that. Indeed, he was asked to go and bring down sprig tables to set up in the corridor so they could organise all these files for photocopying. They then, McRae then found out, caused an absolute stushy, and the police told him that they were taken in to protect him because his office had been broken into, without saying it was them that had used the key to get in, and they were returned to him. So the question, was there special branch interest in Willie McRae? There's no real question, although the Scottish judiciary have denied it all the way, although interestingly their language changed over the years to it was not under surveillance to it was not under surveillance at the time of his death. So you can read your own interpretation into that. But interestingly, when McRae's car was found and he was lying there in a coma, when they didn't know at that point he'd been shot, the whiskey bottles weren't there and never seemed to have surfaced, because he did. It looks like instead of going to Dorney when he left West Nile Street, he went back home, and he could have left the bottles there, to be fair. Yeah. But interestingly, they never surfaced. And Donald Morrison makes the not unreasonable point that his evidence was absolutely dismissed. Didn't happen. And he made the point that one of the reasons that the bottles weren't there because his fingerprints would have been on the bottle. And the bottles were never discovered. However, I've got a handwritten testimony from Mackay, the owner of the off license. No, Donny Mackay. I'll come back to him in a minute. But they drove. I've got a handwritten statement from him saying, McRae came into my shop. He bought whiskey. He left. So he corroborates everything that Donald Morrison said. unfortunately, it took the police 26 years to interview him. So just as I say, it's a wee bit smelly.
Aye, right. We're going to change the view again here. Wait a minute, because we've got to go back to the gallery. So, Jan, what do you make of that so far?
Yeah, I would like to ask Ron, what was the SNP's response after he was killed? What, did they want to sort of keep their heads down, or was there a big furore about it? Or
Well, both, I guess, John, because he wasn't. Because of the allegations of his involvement with the SNLA and so forth, he was persona non grata for a while in the SN. It was very popular among the rank and file, but Gordon Wilson, for example, did not fancy him at all. And when I'll come to the crash and the injury in a moment, but it was found by a guy called David Coates. And David Coates was, it turns out, was an SNP councillor. And although I write novels, you have to suspend you suspend your imagination when you're writing a novel. But I couldn't have made it up. I could never have got away with the fact that when it was found by an SNP councillor who recognised him, a doctor who was able to treat him, and a professional accident investigator from Australia in the Australian military, whose evidence was crucial. You couldn't make that up. But what was I talking about there? See, what happens is I take the scenic route, and when I take the scenic route, I can't remember where the hell I was going. When was I talking about him leaving Glasgow?
you're talking about the accident in the hospital.
No, it was the SNP. The SNP.
Aye.
And so Willie took a drink. I interviewed Kenny McCaskill because Kenny McCaskill was apprenticed to Willie McRae when he was a young trainee lawyer. And his view was that Willie was a functioning alcoholic. He took a glass. And that's been used by the establishment to say, well, he was a hopeless alcoholic and he was done for drink driving and he was this and he was that and he was the next thing. So when David Coates, who found him, spoke to Winnie Ewing before a meeting of the NEC of the SNP and asked that she bring forward a motion that his death should be investigated by the SNP. And it was carried, much to the chagrin of Gordon Wilson, who was furious because he, as an establishment figure, had agreed with the Lord Advocate that we'll just call it quits. He didn't want McRae and all the stuff that was about McRae coming out into the public. And when the Liberal Archie Kirkwood, when Liberal MP Archie Kirkwood asked questions in the House of Commons, he was berated by Gordon Wilson, who said to Archie Kirkwood that, why are you raising questions about a drunk and a queer? Allegedly. These comments are researched and captured in a book. I tried to get a hold of Archie Kirkwood to have him confirm that, but he never returned my request. So the SNP rank and file loved McRae in great measure, but the hierarchy did not. Winnie Ewing then conducted her inquiry into his death, and she managed to interview all of the individuals who mattered to us on the day, his friends and all the rest of it. But she was not allowed to interview the Procurator Fiscal. She was not allowed to interview the Lord Advocate. She was not allowed to interview the police. And so she returned to the SNP NEC and said, I had anticipated coming back here and confirming that his death was a case of self-harm, but unfortunately I cannot do that. And so in her book, which I've got somewhere here as well, she makes reference to this in some detail that she wasn't able to give the establishment a clean bill of health on this one, and I can well understand why.
Jan?
But was there no two cars or potentially two Volvos involved?
Well, let me explain what happened, and I'll get to that point, Jan.
Aye.
He when he drove north at night time. There is an allegation that somebody had slashed his tires, and the time taken would mean that he was driving later in the dark. But I found no way of corroborating that. It was suggested it had a puncture. I found no way of corroborating that. Some said he had his spare tire in the back seat. That seems not to be the case. But a guy called Fred Aldham saw his Volvo, or a Volvo, abandoned at the very place just about where he crashed on the A87. Abandoned at 3 o'clock in the morning with both doors open, and when he drove past it slowly, he was a fisherman, he was delivering seafood at that time in the morning, and he drove past slowly and noticed that he could see completely through the car because the driver's door and the passenger door were wide open. He saw no one there, and he drove on. And then subsequently, when he discovered what had happened to McRae, he phoned the police and told them of this, waited for them to interview him, and they never so much as lifted the phone. The next morning, he was found by a guy called Alan Crowe, who was an Australian military accident investigator, professionally qualified, who had driven past the Volvo. It was down towards the loch, and his wife persuaded him to go back just in case there was somebody in it. It was sufficiently far down the hill, they had binoculars to see what was in it, went down to the car, realized that there was a body there, discovered that it was still sentient, he could feel a pulse. He was then joined by David Coots, the SNP councillor from Dundee, his pal and his pal's girlfriend, who was a doctor, Dr. Messer, and his own girlfriend stayed in the car, and Dr. Messer went down to the car and attended to him, said his eyes were glazed, it suggested a brain injury, but he was alive. And they called, they went, got an ambulance, the ambulance came and took him to Regmore Hospital. And to answer your question, Jan, there was a story in Scottish Eye that there were two different removal companies come out to remove the car. And there is also a suggestion there were actually two different vehicles being removed, but it does make it clear. Again, I've got handwritten statements from the driver and the owner of the garage and his son, who attended and pulled McRae's car up the hill, took it to the garage in Fort Augustus, where the police carried out an investigation on the car. And at that point, they thought, this was the Saturday night, they thought it's a road accident. He was taken, because it was a serious brain injury, he was taken from Inverness to Aberdeen. And there is a difference here because the state say, the Crown says he was x-rayed in Inverness, but the plates were not inspected. When he got to Aberdeen, rather, he was x-rayed again, and the nurse was Catherine McGonigal, who looked at the x-ray. The doctor had left the doctor had left the ward at that point, and she found the bullet pointing at the base of the spine, and alerted the doctor and so forth, who told the police, and all of a sudden it became a potential murder inquiry. And the car had to be assessed once more. But I then spoke to a lifelong professional traffic police officer who was very critical of the police report on the car. For example, it's all things, remarks like okay, rather than the measurement of the depth of the tire or things like that. Mm-hmm. They couldn't test some things because the electrics weren't working, so he wouldn't know certain information about the car. He said that three tires were perfect, and one tire had been had no air pressure because of the crash or the trip down the mountain, without beginning to consider the possibility that it might have been the cause of the crash coming down the mountainside. So he was very critical about that report on the car. But the car does seem to have been moved. And again, there was a suggestion that the car was returned to the scene. But I could honestly find no evidence that that was the case. And it would have been very difficult to do that in all fairness. But what it did mean was that the following morning on the Sunday, when the police came that night and decided it was too dark to look for the gun, so they just drove away. And so the crime scene was not protected. And so anybody could have interfered with that. The next morning, the Australian Alan Crowe came back to the scene, and there were police there in the morning, and asked if he could look for a missing glove. And the police said, "Aye, wire in." So he followed the route of the car. He could see the tire marks. They followed down, looking for his glove, or as he says himself, or the gun that I might have used to kill McRae, and was allowed to do so by the police. Didn't find his glove and left, never to return. But when they removed Willie McRae from the car, he was, as I'll come later on perhaps to contradictions, but he was sitting upright behind the steering wheel, quite peaceful, with his hands in his lap and a seatbelt on. That is the testimony of the people who found him. The police statement was he was found wedged under the wheel without a seatbelt on, but they weren't there. Mm-hmm. And so they make these claims, and I'll come to all these claims perhaps in a moment. So there was all sorts of, and David Coates also found papers torn up and laid in a bundle, one of which was a statement about a repair to his car in a local garage with his name on it, which allowed him to identify positively the fact that this was Willie McRae, and his watch on top of it, all piled neatly. Now, McRae was in a coma, seatbelt, and you remember, you're again all too young to remember the old days when seatbelts used to be fixed. You couldn't move in the seatbelt like you can move, but they were fixed, and he was pinned to his seat, and somehow his papers and his watch were in a pile outside the car, and this was confirmed by the doctor who found him as well, ignored by the police. So taking it forward, I'm missing steps here, but he was taken. So they found the bullet in his head, and he was, and a post-mortem was undertaken. Now, there is a dubiety about where the car crashed, because the cops have got it about a mile further north towards Dorney than David Coates and Alan Crowe, who found him. And that's important, because right between these 2 points is the boundary between the two local authorities. On the one hand, you have Lochaber, and on the other hand, you've got Inverness. And depending on where the car was found, that determines the procurator fiscal that looks after him, the pathologist that looks after him, the police who undertake the inquiry, and so forth. Although, no, that's not fair. The Northern Constabulary covered both areas, but they would know which it was. And so by finding it a mile further north and determining that, that means it goes to Inverness and Aberdeen rather than Fort William. So he was investigated in Aberdeen. Sorry, it was found to be brain dead in Aberdeen, and on following a visit by his brother Fergus, who is a doctor, who is a GP, they turned off the life support machine. And then instead of having a post-mortem in Aberdeen where the body was, they took the body back to Inverness for a pathologist in Inverness to undertake the assessment. And the pathologist said that the bullet was in his temple, but that there were no powder burns on his scalp. And that's important because if it's suicide, if you shoot a gun, you get powder burns in a circle. The further away the gun, the wider the circle of powder burn. And there were none there. And he made the point that even with cleaning, it would be difficult to remove these powder burns. However, his brother, and I have a photograph of his brother and testimony from his brother. And it's important to understand that Fergus, who's still alive and is in his 90s now, wanted all of this to go away. He wanted it quiet, and he never wanted any fuss about this. I have a photograph of him pointing to the back of the neck where he said the bullet entered. And that's exactly the same as the place where the nurse said that the bullet wound was. And we've never been able to reconcile the pathologist report with the evidence from his brother and the nurse. But the pathologist then set out a report saying it was self-inflicted, and because he was right-handed and the bullet was on the right side of his temple, and said that the path of the bullet through his brain demonstrated that there was, you could see powder burns in there. And because of that, and importantly, because of circumstances that were related to me, he said, I view it as self-harm. The only people that could have said circumstances that were related to him was the police. So the next morning, the cops went back looking for the gun and found a gun. Now, the person that found the gun, PC Kenny Crawford, said he found it in a burn some distance from the car. The police officer in charge, the senior police officer, Colin MacDonald, said, who visited it the next morning with other cops, said, we concluded, remember the car wasn't there, we concluded it could only have been at the door of the car. But individual statements from the police say it was found at the passenger's door, it was found at the driver's door, it was found at the rear of the car, and importantly, Kenny Crawford said it was found some distance from the car. 2 bullets had been fired, only one was in the skull. Their reasoning for that was he fired one in the air and then turned the gun on himself. So there's differences of opinion about where that gun was found. And then in the fullness of time, the police managed to lose the gun. So there's no evidence that this gun ever existed. They've lost the gun. And 2 photographs, they say, were taken. They released, eventually, after a lot of questioning, they released a number of photographs of the crash site and of the gun and all the rest of it. And importantly, of the photographs that they released, they had lost the only 2 photographs where they said showed the gun in situ. So they've got no evidence that the gun was in the burn or in the loch. They've got no evidence that they've got the gun because they've lost it all somehow. So again, I found that a bit smelly. Nor was there any evidence that McRae actually owned the gun. Now, the circumstantial evidence suggests that he did own it. He actually got it in India, and that he did have a gun that he carried for his protection, as he suggested. But there is no paper evidence that he owned a gun. And in a court of law, had they tried to prove that, they would have found it difficult. But nevertheless, hearsay or not hearsay, the gun appears to have been the one that was used to put a bullet in his head. But the pathologist was contradicted subsequently by a forensic scientist in the police in Glasgow, who made the obvious point that just because it was that gun and the bullet was shot, whether it was there or there, didn't mean to say it was his finger on the trigger. And they didn't test his hand for powder burns. They didn't test his clothes for powder residue. It was an absolute shambles of an investigation, either because they were an incompetent police force or because they didn't want to find those answers.
I'm absolutely gobsmacked at some of the things that I'm hearing. I've lost my place in everything because I'm like, oh, I'll ask this question, but then you say something else, and I'm like, oh, there's another question I need to ask. John, you want to pick up?
Yeah.
I'm opposed to this.
What was the media take on this? To your understanding, what was the media reporting and saying about it at the time?
I spent a few days in the Mitchell Library, and you're all too young to remember the days when
Aye, definitely.
you had to use microfiche to get the papers. Nowadays, you just go on the internet and it'll come back up. But then I went back up, and you go through the microfiche, you burl it around, and you get the front page of the Herald and so forth. And all I could find was tragic road accident, bloody shame, this man, Mulwhacker, all that stuff. And it took me a while before, it was only later on when the story about the bullets and all the rest of it. And it came out in dribs and drabs. And one of the reasons I wrote the book Firebrand was because I've been asked to by Donald Morrison, the police officer who's now up in the Western Isles, who is furious that his evidence over years has been traduced and ridiculed, where he insists he's telling the truth. And when I went up to interview him in the Western Isles, and the truth shone from his eyes. This man was not telling me lies. And he's told the same story consistently over the years, consistently the same story. And so again, I thought, well, the newspapers would give you a wee bit here and a wee bit there and a wee bit here, and a book would come out with a wee chapter there about it. And I thought, I don't know if anybody's ever written a book about the Hail Jing Bang. So I decided I would give it a whirl. But the media, the most important contribution by the media, I think, was an article written by a senior Herald journalist called John MacLeod, because again, you're too young to remember, the Glasgow Herald, as it was in those days, was like a roll of wallpaper. It was a huge newspaper.
Aye, broadsheet, yeah.
Aye. And he did 4 pages one day and 4 pages another day, all about McRae. And the reason he was able to do that was, despite the fact for the 10 years before that, the Lord's Advocate and the police had all said, you know, the case is closed, it's finished, we're not giving you any information. Then, of course, freedom of information came in, and you could ask these questions. But even when that happened, they were still getting a dead bat to, for the most part, for questions that were being asked. But MacLeod was given access to the file in front of a member of the Scottish judiciary, in front of the Crown, and he wrote all of the things. But what we don't know, of course, is had that file been filleted before it was made available to John MacLeod. But he got a lot of information, started from the presumption that it was suicide. He himself was a Western Islander, and finished the analysis by saying he was angry and that he was now convinced that Willie McRae was murdered. And then another 10 years later, when the Lord Advocate died, he felt able to come out and say, the person who sat opposite me at the table and gave me all of this information and allowed me to ask questions about the McRae case as I went through it was the Lord Advocate himself. So the man that was saying the Scottish public are to be denied this information, nevertheless gave the information to a journalist in the hope, presumably, that he would get a clean bill of health, and the reverse was the case. And he was, I just found it difficult to comprehend the fact that this is how the judiciary works. That there's one law for them and another for the rest of us. You know, they can give interviews and they provide information, and I find it difficult to believe that everything of import would have been in that file. I'm sure somebody would have been through that's not going in it, and that's not going in it. give him that, and still John MacLeod found that he was murdered. Although later on, MacLeod left the Herald and joined the Daily Mail, I think it was, or the Sunday Mail, one of the two, and wrote about it again. And of course, he's got a different readership. So when he wrote about it the second time, McRae was an alcoholic, and he was this, and he was that, and he was the next thing. He was writing to a different audience. But you can't take back the print in 1995 where he said he was murdered.
So, Ron, whereabouts was Willie McRae buried then?
Well, for long enough, I'd assumed that he was cremated because I could see nothing about it. And then I discovered that he was buried in the family lair in Camelin Cemetery, just outside Falkirk. And I went to the grave, and I thought, geez, as you may know, there's a cairn on the A87 up at where the crash was, and that's more of a commemoration of Willie McRae than his gravestone. It's a family lair, and in the front of the lair, at the front of the gravestone, you've got the family, his mother and father, and all this kind of stuff. And at the side of the gravestone, it says Willie McRae, 1923, 1985. That's it. No mention of he's a Scottish patriot. No mention of anything. It's almost as if, can we know, just canny, keep this quiet. And so I'm sure that more people visit the cairn in the A87 up at the Loch than they do visit his grave. It's a beautiful cemetery, very well kept. But I just thought, and so it was one of the reasons, for example, when I wrote Firebrand, I put a lot of photographs in it, because I wanted people to see this is how Scotland treats its heroes. Willie McRae and his date of birth, the birth and death dates. Jeez, astonishing.
Aye. It's angering. It's actually quite angering when you hear it put across like that. I'm trying to be honest there. It's like, as you say, somebody that's contributed so much, even in the short history between then and now, what people are finding out that they didn't know, and for it to be no celebrated for what it was, by the sounds, and it's fascinating. It's angering as well. John, over to you, mate.
Yeah, you're talking about the book of Willie McRae. When will that be available, or where is it available?
Well, I'm not sure yet. It's with the publisher, and as I say, I've written 14 books, and they go in, and the text is approved quickly, and then we argue about daft stuff like the font size and the font that's to be used, and the front cover and the back cover and the blurb and the price of the book, all this kind of stuff. That takes bloody ages, but they clear. This time, it took a while for I don't know. It might have been they had COVID. I don't know. But I just worry that I thought, geez, I hope they're not going to come back and say, sorry, keys up, we can't publish this. But they did. They did. But we're okay. And so now I'm in the process of making sure that the photographs are in the right place in the book, and all of that stuff. This takes weeks. It'll be weeks, but the process has started. We're now into it, and it's now. And
is it going to be paperback or hardback? It used to be hardback, then paperback, but how's it coming out?
But very few books are hardback now, unless you're the Prime Minister or something like that. But no, it's going to be paperback and it's going to be digital. What I used to do was bring out my books in hard copy, and then a few months later, depending on sales, I would put the digital book out. Now I think, bugger that, I can't be bothered with it. I'll just do the two of them at the same time, and people can choose whether they want an actual copy or a digital copy, and they'll come out at pretty much the same time.
And where will it be available? By Amazon type of thing?
Well, Amazon, but it can be Waterson's, it can be the bookstore, it can be anything.
Right.
The publishing's changed now, John. It used to be that when I started this malarkey, you would, Waterston's, for example, would order 10 copies here and 10 copies there. And so 10 copies would be shipped up from England or something. And they would sell 7. And then 3 copies had to be shipped back down. And this was happening all over Scotland, all over the UK, all over the world, actually. Nowadays, books are printed and ordered one at a time.
Right.
One at a time. So if you go into Waterston's and they might have ordered 1 or 2 books, and if it's there, that's fine. If not, we'll get it for you tomorrow if you come in, because you can order them 1 at a time. And that's how Amazon works. But so do a whole range of different stores. But I mean, I've now got about 24,000 followers on Twitter, and I'll make sure it's known that the book's out. And I tell you, there's still a live interest. I mean, I punt my books through Twitter, and McRae book always excites more interest than the other ones, even though the other ones are very, very good. The McRae, and I'm quite sure that Firebrand will take off like a house on fire.
Well, and wouldn't it be nice, Ron, if this was a good way to start or to inflame interest in Scottish independence? Wouldn't that just be coincidentally bloody marvellous? If people could go and pick up this book, read it, buy it digitally, whatever, and that would set their mind thinking, wheels turning, and then we could have a referendum somewhere just in a few months' time after that. Would that just not be bloody marvellous?
That is, in the words of my friend, now deceased Steve McMurtry, that would be the bee's buzz. But what I think it will do is have people who read it think, you know, you look up to the Lord Advocate, you look up to the Chief Constable, you look up to the local inspector of police, you look up to these people.
I know.
You read this book, you think, okay, it was back in 1985, that was 35 years ago. Or my maths on that, but it was a long time ago. But you just think, and by the way, I'm not in the book, I do not come across, I hope, as a swivelized fanatic coming up with all these stories. If it's hearsay, I say it's hearsay. But this is a fact. Here's a written statement. Here's another written statement. Here's a photograph. Here's what the Lord Advocate actually said. Here's what so I've got it all down, and people will judge. And so rather than inflame passions for independence, which it might, it's more likely to have people think, you know, I'm going to look at these people a bit differently in the future. If they tell me 1 and 1's 2, I'm going to question it.
Aye. John, were you going to say something there?
Aye, can I say something?
Aye.
What I like about it, I'm reading Alba at the moment. I downloaded it to the Kindle. I've not finished it. But he's got his wee subversive group, and it's Alba.
Anti-God.
And it's,
I came up with that before Alba was formed.
Exactly. That tickles me.
I'd like to think that Alex Salmon looked at the book and said, you know, I know what I'm going to call it.
That's the inspiration. Well, there you go. Well, I was actually going to say to you, Ron, because obviously Jan's just mentioned Alba, who shot Willie McRae. You wrote that to fantastic acclaim. You've got Firebrand coming out. You've got all of these. You've got a plethora of wonderful reading materials. A lot of them geared towards Scotland and the betterment of Scotland. What do you make of the current political situation in Scotland?
I'm a member of the SNP and Alba, and if one of them want to kick me out, why around? Because one of the books I wrote, a number of the books I wrote, I talk about the way that the British establishment have worked over the years, whether it's in India, whether it's in Ireland, whether it's the left wing of in politics in the UK, is that they split, they divide and rule, and they're doing it to great effect in Scotland. We've got ISP, we've got Alba, we've got the SNP, we've got and you know, I'm saying, you know, when the day comes that we've got an independence vote, we better be singing for the same hymn sheet. And it does my nutting. It honestly does my nutting when I find colleagues, comrades, friends attacking one another. It's precisely what these people want, precisely what they want. And so by all my preference would have been that Alba would have been a party within a party. It would have been a party within the SNP, and we're all pals. We just take a different view on this and a different view on that, but we're all in the same boat. And when I see the British establishment must be laughing their way to the bank because they've managed to split the movement. And look, I remember going on all under one banner march in Edinburgh, and I just come out of an operation in my spine, so I couldn't walk very, very far. It was a bloody shame for me, by the way, but I still travelled through Edinburgh, and I sat with my flag in a pub in the Royal Mile, and 3.5 hours later, well, 3.5 hours later, I was pretty pissed, mind you, but 3.5 hours later, we were still coming down that hill. And now, there was hundreds of thousands of people there. And now I see dribs and drabs and different organisations starting marches here, marches there, marches there. I'm thinking, oh, Christ almighty. If only people could understand that that is precisely what the British establishment want to happen. And maybe it's about time we started to heal. We're talking about moving to a referendum next year. We better start soon. Even with Wishart, the MP, when he talked about vote till you vote all the way down the line, couldn't he help but say, and even me, and he slagged off, gee, for Christ's sake, if we can't get our politicians to behave, what chance have we got? So I'm a member of both parties, and as I say, and if one of them wants to kick me out, tell me why.
When you're talking about sitting in the pub that time that match was on the big one, yeah. I can remember watching. I was on Twitter about it. I was watching the media. I was watching Sky News and that at the time. And the thing that really, I mean, I'm fascinated by the British media and media in general because I've learned a lot about it since 2014. How manipulative they are, how they control the agenda and everything else. And the thing that stuck out to me that day was that Sky News were reporting about a protest march in France with 3,000 people at it, but they didn't say a word about all these people in Scotland marching for independence in Edinburgh. Not one word. And yet they talked about a protest in France with 3,000 people in it on every news bulletin in Sky News that day. And that just
I wouldn't get too excited about it, John, because that's just the way. That's their job.
Like that,
They're doing their job. I mean, they're doing their job and they're good at it.
But look what's happening now. Even tomorrow, we've got a new news channel starting, Talk 24 or whatever it's taught. So it's another right-wing biased channel who's going to control the narrative, who's going to have right-wing propaganda on a loop, just like GB News, Sky News, BBC, and everything else. So how difficult it is us to get any right and information out to people who are interested to hear something from a British point of view, because we've got no media on our side. This is the only media we've got, a platform like this, and people speaking up, people who wrote books or like yourself who are very knowledgeable about it. But it's so difficult to get people who want independence but don't maybe think about it as much as we do as a necessity. They'll vote for it, because I know people like that who say they'll vote for it when it comes, but they're not interested in really how we get there. But it's how we motivate these people to be interested enough to think outside the box and be smart enough to ignore this crap and see what it's for, what we're getting fed day in, day out.
I know, and that's not going to change. Let's be clear. You're not going to all of a sudden, the BBC isn't going to change. I mean, I've not got my notes with me just now, but when I used to, before COVID, I would do a lot of book tours, speaking to Yes groups or Pensioners for Independence or SNP constituency meetings all over Scotland. And I was able to talk about, for many, many years, they say it's not happening now, but for many, many years, if you wanted a job in the BBC, your file was put, there was an office in the BBC headquarters, and I'm not making this up, it's a matter of record, where the MI5 would go through that file and they'd put a wee Christmas tree on it if that was you, that was the boy in the slates. But frankly, initially, not because they were worried that somebody might come on and start talking about Scottish independence. They were worried that technicians, cameramen, might decide we're not covering the royal wedding or something like that, and that these technicians would get unionized and mess about. So that's what they were interested in. But MI5, then they said they were doing that, but how the hell do we know if they've stopped doing that or not? So they're saying that the BBC are doing their job. They do it very well in terms of propaganda for the state. But the good thing is they're making the political opposition themselves making such an arse of things just now that you know, it's at least they're doing that bit of their job right.
Aye. Jan, if you get something you want to come on there, on you go.
Aye. I mean, what pricked my interest in Willie McRae a few weeks back was Sarah Salyers, when she said what she's doing on the claim of rights was picking up on what the Willie McRae had been doing. And I went looking for maybe speeches or whatever, that the stuff Willie done for SNP, and you can't find anything other than his murder.
Well, I'm not aware of that, Jan, but there's no question that McRae was a very able and determined member of the independence movement. Whether he was a wee bit sleek in his ways sometimes, who knows? But it was also a very, I mean, in the book, I've taken a lot of quotes, and even people who, like Len Murray, who was his partner, who worked with him, he praises him in the heavens. What an able, intelligent, witty, determined man. He could inspire audiences like no politician I've ever seen before or since, said his partner, despite being in the opposing camp. So he was a very special man. And the notion that his resting place is marked by his name, it's a shame. It's a shame.
When you
I walk the dogs in a cemetery near me in Eastwood, and most days I walk past the grave of John McLean, and that's what it says on him as well, John McLean. Yeah, and sister, and that's it. So
it's mad, right? We're coming to an end. There's one question that I like to try and get this in as often as possible. I think I know the answer to this with yourself though, Ron. Should Scotland be an independent country? Yes or no?
Take your time.
I think, honestly, I was a member of the Labour Party for about just under 40 years. I stood for the Labour Party for the Scottish Parliament on the list, and I'm a left winger. But even when I was in the Labour Party, I always took the view that this isn't right. Scotland should have devolution, independence. And now it's my passion. It's my passion. I am ever convinced that the way that Scotland is treated by perfidious Albion is disgraceful. And I understand Nicola, who is saying, softly, softly, catch you monkey. We've got to bring that. But there's a third of people who are convinced nationalists, a third of people who are convinced unionists, and there's a big lump of people in the middle that are saying, maybe's aye, maybe's not. And we need to win them over. And we're not going to win them over if we're all William Wallace. We need to win them over by argument and so forth. I get that. But I'm hoping that behind the scenes, there is a hell of a lot of work going on to outmaneuver these idiots down south, because the opportunities that lie ahead for Scotland if we're independent are massive, massive. The favourite countries, I've travelled all over the world on the strength of my books. I've written travel books. I love the Nordic countries where they've got independence and their left-wing policies. They look after their people. And I would love Scotland to be part of some kind of Nordic alliance, whether it's through EFTA, whether it's through the EEC, whether it's whatever it is, a Nordic arrangement. I don't mind that there's pros and cons, but the notion of me living long enough to see a left-wing socialist independent Scotland thriving is what keeps me going from day to day.
Superb.
Aye, well, it sounds like a dream to me, I know. Right, we're out of time for this evening.
Yeah.
I could have kept this going for hours, because I'm sure that myself, Jan and John, there's more questions that arose as we were going through that there.
Well, the other thing, Peter, is that I promise you, I've only scratched the surface of this. There's loads of other information I could have given you about McRae and the contradictions of a whole chapter on contradictions, what the states say and what the actual facts are. They're pulling the wool over our eyes, and I look forward to the book coming out and to people reading it and making their own minds up. But frankly, if they've got a brain in their head, there's only one thing they can.
Only one summation they can come to. Right, well, on that note, this is where we usually do it. Ron, I'll get you to say good night to the audience. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone that's taken the trouble to look in and listen to me blathering on. I've thoroughly enjoyed answering the question of Jan, John and Peter, and I hope it's whetted your appetite to buy Alba or Dalriada or Rebellious Scots to Crush or
Only another 12 to go.
But I've not got Firebrand yet, but when it comes out, I'll be letting people know through Twitter. So God bless. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks very much,
you.
Ron. Over to you, John. Say good night, mate.
Yeah, it's been fascinating listening to you tonight. It's wheels turning in my head here, and that'll keep me up all night now. I'll still be sitting looking for stuff on the internet now. So fascinating character, and I'm going to buy your book when it comes out. And I don't know if I follow you on Twitter, but I'm going to as soon as I get off this damn thing. So
I blog to Glasgow. See what I did there? I blog.
Thank you.
At all. Jan, over to you.
Oh, I'm going to download Dalriada next. I'm hooked.
Well,
yeah, thanks, Ron. That was great. Very informative.
Yep. Well, it's so, as I said, we're right out of time for the night. We could have went on for hours. I've the same wheels going in my head that I think John's got in his head. If anything, Ron's book sales are going to shoot up massively because download all the rest of the bits that we've no read.
Oh, 30.
Because, as I say, the Alva who shot Willie McRae to absolutely great acclaim. Firebrand, hopefully, will follow that up. And if you're Scottish and interested in Scotland and the betterment of Scotland, it's these kind of books that you should be reading to find out where it went wrong and how they can do it better. Aye. So for Ron Culley, for JB Whitesnake, for Jan, for Cinnamon Bridges at Tweed Street and the Satirical Saltire, it's good night. We hope you enjoyed the offerings. We'll catch you again soon.
Thank you.
All the best.